Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 28 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. This month, we will explore some insights into racial justice, and we will talk with folks in our community who are largely an overwhelmingly white community here in the greater Olympia area. And the four guests we have also are white folks so that we can talk directly and clearly with each other about the topic for this program, which is about racial justice. Within any very large group of people, such as a whole nation, power is not distributed evenly. Some kinds of people have more political, economic, and social power than other kinds of people in that society. In the United States, a big factor affecting the unequal distribution of power is a person's race. The historical roots in our country go back 400 years to the early 1600s, when European colonialists came here and took the land from the Native Americans who were living here. And also in the early 1600s, the colonists brought slaves here from Africa to work without any human rights whatsoever. The legacy of 400 years of racial discrimination persists in various ways, and that's what we'll be talking about during this hour. We also will talk about what people can do about that. Also, over the years, many other immigrant groups who came here voluntarily experienced discrimination and bias based on their ethnicity or race. Imbalances of power are experienced both as overt discrimination and also in more subtle ways that allow the dominant majority to have unfair advantage over people who are not in the majority. And so we will explore these kinds of things. We have four very knowledgeable people whom I respect, who are all part of a group called Olympia Unity in the Community that works for racial justice and other kinds of inclusiveness and egalitarianism and safety for all kinds of people in our community and beyond. I'm happy to welcome Lori Rasmussen, Alec Clayton, Kathy Barrows-Freet, and Jim Bamberger. Good to have you all here.
Thank you
for
for
having
having
an
us.
interesting hour and raise some things that people don't otherwise hear on mainstream TV or mainstream any kind of media. A moment ago when I introduced the program, I said the United States has 400 years of racial oppression in our history. Kathy, I wonder if you could address the question that some people ask after Barack Obama was elected in 2008. People said, well, now we have a post-racial America. And what's your take on that?
No.
Well, that was easy.
I think what was amazing about the election of an African-American man to be president of the United States, it was a watershed moment. And it was not just that we had a president that came from those roots and was a person of color, but that was a moment when the broadest population of voters we probably had ever seen. Maybe more whites because they didn't want to think about this black president, but certainly a large number of people who had never voted before, a large number of young people who had never voted before, a large number of African Americans, other people of color who had so much hope. We weren't done, but all of a sudden we had turned the corner. We were on a different plateau, and it was just an opportunity for us to be reflective of more what our population really is. And so it was an opportunity. Yeah. Aren't done by any means. But I don't think anyone thought so.
Yeah, so we're not really a post-racial nation, but we've had a change, and now maybe there are some things that could be discussed.
Yeah, it's a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, okay, great. Alec, I want to check with you about something. You grew up in Mississippi. A lot of people in the North and in the West think this race stuff is something for the South, or it's something for people who fly Confederate flags, or who oppose Confederate flags, or stuff that was like back decades ago but no longer relevant now. What would you think about that kind of a geographic segmentation of the issue?
Well, the first thing is I should make it clear that it's not just the South. There are racists all over this country, in every state and in every city and town. Mm-hmm. There is a difference, though. It is much more prevalent in the South. Mm-hmm. It always has been and probably always will be. When I was growing up in the South, it was such an integral part of everybody's life that we just didn't think about it. It just was. Mm-hmm. I remember when we went to football games, they played Dixie and everybody stood up and saluted like it was the national anthem. Mm-hmm. I was there when the schools were first integrated, back when James Meredith integrated Ole Miss, the first black person to go there, and there were riots on campus. And where I lived, 200 miles south of there, all the kids in my high school were marching around the campus chanting 2468, we will never integrate. Mm-hmm. And that culture is not here. Right. So there's a lot of racist activity, a lot of racist people in Olympia, just as everywhere else, but it's not such an integral part of the culture.
So for people who want to deal with the issues, solve the problems, it would be different strategies, some different aspects of the issues in places like Olympia compared to what you would have in
Yeah, I think we first have to recognize the problem. Going back to what Kathy was talking about, I know it's been very popular among a lot of people, very well-meaning people, to say, I don't recognize color. Mm-hmm. Everybody's the same. Mm-hmm. But that's putting your head in the sand. Right. It's denying the problem.
Right. Jim, you told me on the phone when we were preparing for the program that you grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Correct.
Tell us about that experience, and that also was decades ago, but
it was decades
what we
ago.
think of as a white,
Thank you for the reminder.
But it's what we think of as a white place. But
actually, Milwaukee, Wisconsin was in the 60s and continues today to be the most geographically segregated, structurally segregated city in the United States. Mm-hmm. You can go to any border, any boundary, and you can see African American there, Caucasian there, African American there, Mexican American there. It's extraordinarily segregated. And when I was growing up, I remember quite vividly in 1967 and 1968, the National Guard had to take ownership of what was then known as the inner core of the city because the African American community gave up on normal channels of protest and normal channels of assertion of rights, and the city blew up.
Because those normal methods were not getting the response from
exactly.
The power
the
structure.
issues in the day, in those days, and continue in this day in different ways, but the issues in that day was open housing, the right to fair housing, freedom of movement, removing of racially restrictive covenants, and all of the things that now are embedded into law but are not practiced.
Right. I was just going to ask about that next, because we have a century or half a century ago these civil rights laws that were passed by Congress in 64, 65, and so forth, that created legal rights, you know, for civil rights on paper, often not in practice. And then recently the U.S. Supreme Court rolled back important parts of the Voting Rights Act from 1965.
Yeah, and surprisingly and gratifyingly, the Supreme Court had the opportunity to roll back the Fair Housing Act this last term. I'm a lawyer, and so this is what I do. I've represented poor people and poor and minority people my whole life. And I'm grateful for the fact that the court did not gut, as it did the Voting Rights Act, did not gut the Fair Housing Act, and allows plaintiffs to demonstrate that disparate impact of housing practices, housing finance practices, land use practices that operate to the disparate negative detriment of African Americans and other minority communities can still be asserted in our courts consistent with the rule of law.
And those problems that result in legal action, those problems still persist in various ways. So
all across the nation,
nationwide,
including here in Washington.
Alec, I want to check with you also, because people in Olympia, we're kind of smug in thinking that like Olympia is so much better than everybody else, and problems happen elsewhere, but not really so much here. We think of ourselves as progressive and inclusive. What's your take on that? And you've been here for decades now.
I've been here since 1988.
Yeah.
And by way of analogy, get off of race for a moment onto a similar situation. I had a son who was bisexual, who was assaulted in a hate crime on the grounds of Olympia High School because he was openly bisexual. We had recently moved from Mississippi to Olympia thinking we were going to one of the cool places, one of the safe places where this kind of thing didn't happen. But that brought it home to us in a very powerful way that it happens everywhere.
Yeah, people in Olympia are shocked when something like that happens, or Bob Buchanan, who is of two races, was murdered because he was biracial. And I mean, when things happen, and they do happen here in Olympia, every time people are shocked, like, where did this come from? So there's something underneath in every part of our society that...
The other side of that coin is that when our son was assaulted, people in Olympia, Olympian Unity in the community to be exact, organized an anti-hate rally immediately, and the outpouring of support was much greater than I think it may have been anywhere else.
Yeah, well, all of us are part of Olympia Unity in the community, and then there are lots more of us who are not here on the TV set, working for inclusiveness and fairness and so forth. Lori, I want to check with you next about something. When I introduced the topic for this program, I framed it in terms of big systems, power imbalances. And is it fair to think about racial justice issues in terms of power imbalance? There may be other things going on as well, but is that at least one entree into the topic? Or how would you see the context?
I absolutely think so. Political, economic, and social systems are made up of people. And we are only as well or as ill collectively as a society as our individual members. And to touch on something that Alex and Jim both said, one of the ways that social, economic, and political power gets funneled is in more subtle and more subtle ways. Sometimes it's not the overt racism of singing Dixie or calling somebody a racist name. Sometimes it's zoning laws and housing. I just heard an article on the news this morning about Seattle Mayor Ed Murray is spearheading an effort to, if not do away with, very much diminish single-family housing zoning in Seattle, and talked about, I didn't know this, its roots were in racist redlining practices to keep primarily minorities, but associated economic poorer people out. And so when power is concentrated in the hands of the folks who get elected, who get the heads of small caucuses and city municipalities and counties and states and the country, when that power is concentrated in the hands of people who aren't aware and who don't care about all people, that is one of the ways that racism perpetuates.
Yeah, you mentioned the connection between race and economic class. So if the intent of that zoning that you mentioned was to keep out the kinds of people who live in apartments as opposed to the better people who live in single-family homes, that's an economic class thing that's correlated with race. And so to see those connections is important. One of the things I've noticed when white folks talk about race is they try to change the subject and talk about economic class instead, and kind of shy away from talking about race and switch the subject over to class. So although there's a relationship between them,
absolutely,
we got to deal with both on their own terms directly and clearly.
And they are interrelated. Starts from schools that are funded or not funded in neighborhoods that are or are not primarily of one race or another. It starts when employers have more likelihood of interviewing or hiring or even calling back someone with a name that sounds like it's a particular race. It's all interconnected. We can't look at it as separate silos.
Yeah.
We are all interconnected, I believe.
If I might follow up and agree with Lori on this, it's race and poverty are extraordinarily intertwined, and they always have been intertwined. Opportunity is structurally embedded into the systems that we've built in society. Wealth accumulation, income accumulation, quality of schools, who's in jail, whose fathers are being ripped out of their homes because of a criminal justice system that targets African Americans, that targets Native Americans, who has to grow up without strong families, the demise of the family is disproportionately, whose children are being removed from their families because of child welfare system that disproportionately punishes people with different cultures, different identity, different color. So it's all a part of that.
Yeah, it's all kind of, and when we talk about race, we often think about black and white, but what's the income level on Indian reservations? I mean, there's
or urban
poverty.
Indian populations,
or urban, and then to the extent that farm work is disproportionately done by Latinos in this country, farm work doesn't pay well, and I mean all these things are connected. And to resolve these things, we have to look at all these things, recognizing the interconnections, but also, I just want to reassert that white folks tend to change the subject rather than do like you're doing and linking things. White folks, I've noticed, tend to change the subject, get away from talking about race and talk about economic class. That feels more comfortable for us.
There are very simple responses that we in the dominant cultural society have. So for example, if I tell you that there are 2% of the population of Olympia, Washington is African American, but nearly 10% of the people in jails in Thurston County are African American, people default to, well, that's because blacks are more inclined to commit crimes. But the research tells us precisely the opposite, right? The research tells us actually that whites on a per capita basis are more inclined to commit crime. They just don't get caught, or they don't get prosecuted, or they don't go to jail.
Right, yeah.
Or for as long.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Kathy, I want to check back with you on something. A very useful way for understanding race is the concept of white privilege. And I know I've talked recently in preparation for the program and in light of recent events in our community, I've had the occasion to talk with a number of white folks about this. And I found some people who have never heard of the term white privilege. And I wonder if you could summarize that concept. I think it's important for our community to get that concept.
I think understanding the concepts of white privilege and being alert to it and starting to recognize it is huge. So one of the things I think we're hoping this program helps address is those who are white, anti-racist. How do I be an ally? What do I do? How do I, are there right ways to do things, wrong ways to do things? One of the things is to educate themselves on a number of things, and one of them being on what is white privilege. So there's lots, Google white privilege, you'll get lots of things to read. And the thing to understand most about white privilege is that it's those of us who have it don't acknowledge it, don't know it's there, it's invisible, because it's inherent in that we were born into. We were born into a white skin. We were born into this country, and we have privilege, not because we earned it or we worked hard or we're any better, but we were just born into it. And that brings with it some assumptions about what our rights are, where our voices should be heard, what our role should be, that our opinion matters more than perhaps people from a community of color. And white privilege is an absence of awareness that what you have and how you behave and how you're treated to more advantageous affect frequently is not through anything you did. It just is there. And those who are in the communities of color don't have that. They have automatically some suspicion. If someone, the white privileges make some assumption about which students are the better students, which citizens are the more trustworthy, which reporters are the more credible, which employee is more deserving of a raise. The folks who are exercising some prejudicial behavior frequently, and I think Lori alluded to that, it's not intentional, it's not being mean, they don't know they're doing it, they're unaware that their own culture, their own socialization has embedded some concepts in them that is coloring their lens.
Right.
And the communities of color are fighting up against that constantly, in subtle ways, little bitty ways, and in huge ways.
Yeah, one of the aspects of privilege is that as a white person, I don't even have to pay attention to my race.
Right.
I can go all day long
and
never think about my race. If I were a person of color, I would not have that luxury because there would be all these reminders to me about what my color is.
Every day, every moment, every interaction, particularly in a community as white as this community is, you are seen as different, you are engaged as being different. People make just a range of implicit assumptions about you, about your family, your value system, this, that, and you've just got these millions of little cuts that go on.
And you mentioned the cuts, and Lori mentioned the cuts, and I'd like to add something to that. I think people are more comfortable acknowledging racism when it's some a racist behavior or incident, when it's something overt. The noose is hanging in the workplace locker, which is still happening in Olympia within the last month, thank you very much. Or a black man is dragged behind the truck in Texas. Those are overt and clearly, racist. But there's not an appreciation for those little bitty subtle things that the person of color and the community of color witness every day, little nicks, little jabs, little pokes. And the thing that's, there's lots of unsettling about it, but the thing that's unsettling about that is you never know when it's going to happen. You never know when it's the post worker or your kid's friend who makes a comment, or it comes in subtle and zing, here's this little thing that reminds you, oh yeah, they think you're different, they're treating you different, and less than. And it's those little cuts that are I'm not going to say one is more or less important, but they're wearing.
But
they're
that's
wearing.
the grind.
And
that's
the
the grind.
And then there are things that benefit white folks that we didn't ask for, but that happened. And I want to share one story from my own background. My dad was one of the lowest paid people at a warehouse or a pulp mill in Everett. that mill had 385 employees. All of us were white, except there was one Indian guy, one guy from, I don't know what tribe he was. But they had a policy of, if you're an employee and you have a kid going to college, they would give you a summertime job to help provide vacation relief for the other employees who were taking vacation. And so they had a policy of hiring the employees' kids. Well, what happened is they were hiring a bunch of white kids because it was all white employees, except for this one guy out of 385. Now, this was not an overt racist attack on people who aren't white. It was just built into that system. And I was aware of that back then, in 1970-ish, late 60s and 70, 71. I thought, oh, there's bias built into this. And I don't know that I discussed it with anybody, but I at least was aware of that because it was a built-in thing. I had not heard the term white privilege there, but I could recognize the concept of what was systemic in discrimination. Anyway.
Exactly.
Kathy, one aspect that we mentioned here is that we can avoid, white folks don't have to deal with race.
Right.
Is there anything else that we need to say about either that aspect or anything else? Because the privilege aspect is I think one of the main points probably of the program. And we have males have privilege over women. Straights have privilege. There's all kinds of privilege systems.
I think the only link I would want to make more obviously is that with that comes the ability to influence. That's what this is all about. It's power and the ability to influence. And when these other subtle things are going on, those who are not white, mainstream, aren't able to have those opportunities to influence. So white privilege plays out in a way that allows people, without even thinking about it, exercise power and influence in all kinds of systems, both in the family and in the community and politically as well.
And just grossly disproportionate opportunity. You get from the day you're born, if you're white, and particularly if you're a white male. You have opportunities at your disposal all the way through childhood, all the way through your college years, all the way, access to college, this, that, and the next thing. And you can work hard, but so will the other person work hard. The difference is, and a dear colleague of mine who actually teaches at St. Martin's, gives me this metaphor, which I find extraordinarily useful, which is when I lived my life and continue to live my life, I'm floating on the river in my raft and I'm going downhill with the current and it's just a dandy time. Yeah, there's an obstacle here and an obstacle there. But if I'm a member of a minority community, if I'm African American with the same level of skill, the same level of brains, but my name isn't Jim, it's Jamal, it's a whole different thing. I'm fighting up current the entire time. And again, we call it the cuts, we call it the grind, we call it the, fighting upstream. It's just taxing and taxing and taxing.
Lori, you have a story from a university library. Can we move on to that?
It's another one of those cuts.
Daily jabs.
Daily cuts. When I was in college, I was at the library, and it was early in my college life, early into having awareness. It was an inner city community college, and I was standing behind an African American, and he was standing at the yellow line before the counter, and the Caucasian librarian looked past him, excuse me, Alec, past him at me and said, "Can I help you?" I was stunned. And all I could say was, "He's first." And she got this really angry look on her face and begrudgingly helped him. And guess who got a call at 10 o'clock that night about my library book that was past due from that very same librarian? And that was what I will call some race traitorship. I think she was very mad that I spoke up about that, but it is so important that we as white people, I think, within our individual abilities and skill and comfort, if we can pass past that comfort level just a little bit, it's important to stand up, I think, and say something. And I can't even imagine. I can kind of try to imagine, but really I can't imagine what it would be like to be that young man daily, 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 daily.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kathy, when we were preparing for the program and we were talking on the phone, you mentioned about the combination of prejudice plus privilege plus power. We've talked about all three of these.
Yeah, I think we were touching on it when we were talking about the influence.
Each of these.
Because, you know, being racist is when you have that combination of prejudice, which means you have a preconceived negative perception about some community or some individual, some race, and that's combined with privilege that you bring with you automatically. It gives you a sense of entitlement and not appreciate the circumstances and the conditions of the other, plus power, which comes with all of that. Those things together, when they're exercised in this influential way, negatively against communities of color, there's a huge amount of power that comes with that, and the ability to influence. And part of what makes our lives and us feel autonomous and independent and able to grow and learn and earn in ways we want is because we feel we can influence our surroundings. And that's a vacuum that sometimes exists when you don't have that combination. You don't have privilege, you don't have power.
Yeah. I want to shift us a little bit. We've been talking about the systemic system, the injustices that are built into our systems. And we also know that things get programmed into us because, as some of us have mentioned, we grew up in a country that has this legacy of racial bias in it. And so we end up unwittingly adopting things that we had not intentionally done any more than I intentionally chose to speak the English language. It was just what was around me, and I just picked it up, you know, without a conscious choice. So racial inequity is built into our individual selves. Congress passed laws, as we said earlier, 50 years ago to protect rights. And is there anything that, and Jim commented on that, and is there anything else we want to say about that relationship between the systems that we have and what happens maybe on the surface versus what happens implicitly or subtly? And we've addressed some of this.
Well,
I just want to see if there's any loose ends.
I'd just like to note that whatever the system, the systems on their face are equal. They are designed to operate equally. They operate unequally. On their face, they don't discriminate. In practice, they discriminate. So if you look at the child welfare system and you look at the disparate number of children who are pulled out, African American children, Native American children who are pulled out. If you look at the disparate numbers of African Americans who are stopped, who are prosecuted, who are incarcerated, the disproportionate number of children in our schools who are African American or Native American, who are disciplined, and then who are brought into the juvenile justice system for behaviors that anybody else could do, but because of who they are and how they look and how they act, drives them into this school-to-prison pipeline that is just filling the juvenile justice system disproportionately with young kids of color. It's really troubling.
There's all kinds of systems that lead that way. At the end of May of 2015, I did some research about the death penalty in Washington State in terms of race. I've been working for decades to abolish the death penalty, and I wanted to see what was currently happening. 4 out of the 9 people on Washington's death row now are black. That does not reflect either the population or the murder rate, but what it does do is reflect who gets to serve on juries. Everybody in Washington State's death row was convicted by an all-white jury. If you have your voting rights taken away because you've been convicted of a felony, that's racially biased, that's disproportionate against poor folks and minorities. So they're excluded from jury duty. And there's just all kinds I wrote up a thing about racial bias in Washington State's death penalty. It's on the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation's website. But the point is that every system, even if it purports to be written in a neutral way,
officially neutral, right.
Officially it's neutral, but the biases feed into it, and the results end up being grossly disparate.
Correct.
I don't know if this is the place, we haven't introduced the term of white allyship yet.
Oh, go ahead.
But I think one of the, in answer to that unasked question, what can white people do about this?
Yeah.
I think in this discussion about systemic and institutionalized systems that have it embedded, those who have white privilege are more likely to be in those social economic circles, in those networks, be in the policymaking roles and opportunities to affect that. So one of the things those who are white allies can do, and you do this in your work, all three of you do this in your work, is to, by your own awareness and education, hold the system accountable, push for changes, make clear that those things are inherently prejudicial, and to call to question, and to invite people to planning meetings or to the table, or bring in voices who would otherwise not be heard, invite to the table folks who would otherwise not be there. So when you, one way to, what can white people do about this, that want to that appreciate the job around advocating for social justice, is to use it where you are. Use it where you are in your networks, and where you have influence in your voice, use your power.
Right, so if you have the concept of white privilege as a result of having watched this TV program, you can sort of be alert and recognize when something happens, you go, oh, I just had some unwanted privilege here in this situation, that, and just even to make just a mental note of it, or to make a mental note of when somebody else is not. A couple of days ago, a friend of mine who's white told me he was in downtown Olympia, and he saw a black friend of his across the street downtown. And so my white friend jaywalked across the street, and he noticed the look of horror on his black friend's face as this white guy was jaywalking, because my white friend recognized my black friend does not have the freedom to jaywalk. He would get nailed for it, and I'm getting away with it. And my friend said it was an eye-opener. He just thought of white privilege. It's like, uh-oh, this just happened.
It's sort of like buying a Volkswagen. You buy a Volkswagen, and suddenly you see all the Volkswagens. I think if any one of us starts to take account for that and just notice it, oh, that thing I did.
That's what that is.
That's what that was.
Yeah.
And it feels so easy and so invisible.
Right, and so to mention it to somebody, if you're with somebody and you say, hey, look what just happened. Here's an example of white privilege.
Right.
Then we start, on this program, on this TV program, we'd like to do a lot of bottom-up grassroots organizing, movement building. And if white allies, the term you introduced a moment ago, and we'll talk about further in the program, if white people were mindful of being allies and mentioning when they observe white privilege happening, and if that were to happen, spark, it would be like your phenomenon of now I recognize somebody that has a car like mine.
And that's one side of it, but Kathy pointed out another side. There is the opportunity to use your privilege.
Yes.
When you have access, when you have influence, and you see things that are not working or are working to the disparate disadvantage of people of color or communities of color, we have a responsibility as allies to point those things out and to work for the change, the structural change, to ensure equity as opposed to so-called equality.
Right.
Could I say one more thing on that to piggyback? I applaud that, and I think it's so important that we do that in whatever ways we're able. And one of the things that I think is a challenge for many white folks who are not of economic privilege is to see themselves as having power.
Right.
I think it's much easier for folks who are educated, who have good jobs, maybe are in positions of influence and power, but for those white folks who are economically disadvantaged, who are in junk jobs and just trying to make ends meet, and maybe they can't, and they have 2 or 3 jobs, and public assistance, maybe not. It's much harder for folks in those positions to think that they have privilege and power, but we all benefit from it, regardless of our class. If we look parallel, a Caucasian person in that circumstance and an African American person or a Hispanic person or Native American person in that circumstance, there's an awful lot more opportunity.
Right.
There's the benefit of the doubt, et cetera.
Right. Lori, I want to ask you one other thing that folks can do. Every now and then, even people of goodwill will sometimes say something and go, oh, I shouldn't have said that. That was like the wrong thing to say. How you have insights into how to deal with ourselves when we've said something or done something that was not so good.
Yeah. So very recently, one of our members of Unity in the community, Gabby Clayton, passed out a video of Jay Smooth. It's a YouTube video, and I understand the credits will be at the end.
The YouTube URL is actually long stuff.
Yeah.
But you could do a web search for Jay Smooth.
Yes.
Race.
Yes.
At YouTube.
Yes.
And you'd find it. It's circulating around.
Yes.
So tell us about.
There's a particular video that a TED talk that he did about.
Do the TED. It's TEDx.
TEDx.
Jay Smooth YouTube, and you'll be sure to find it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
great.
he has this 12-minute video, or almost 12-minute video, that's so useful in letting us start to understand how systems of race affect our interactions and how we interface with our own notions of having or not having racism. And he talks about it akin, rather than thinking about it as I do or don't have tonsils. For example, I'm not racist. I can't have said something racist. I had my tonsils removed in 2005. Really, it's more like having good hygiene. If we have good hygiene, we brush our teeth. And if we don't have good hygiene, we have something stuck in our teeth. And he invites people to think about when we've done or said something racist, to think of it like that. Oh, I didn't take care of that racist thing in my teeth. I need to clean it out. It's daily practice of, if we see something on our own that we've done or said, to acknowledge it. Right. To simply say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I did not mean that in the way that it sounded.
Yeah.
And let a simple apology, a simple accountability, if something more needs to happen, to say that. Yeah. If someone else brings it to our attention, to recognize that we're not perfect human beings. And it's the same as saying to someone, that hurt my feelings. If we can hear someone else telling us we've said something that sounded racist, to hear it in the way of, you said something that hurts my feelings. Take accountability for it, apologize, and do better next time.
Yeah, yeah.
One thing I would like to add to that is, I'm not sure if it's in the same video or another one, but the Jay Smooth video.
He's my hero.
Yeah. But he made, I think, a very crucial point when confronting someone about racist acts. Say the act was racist, or what you said was racist, not you are racist.
Yeah.
Right.
Because if you say you are, they immediately become so defensive that you never get beyond that point.
Yeah, and in fact, a person, as a person, is not identical to a particular thing they may have done or a particular thing they may have said. They're a whole person with all the complexity we have, but it was a particular behavior or a particular spoken thing. So that's a very useful distinction.
I think that's
else?
Well. Teeing off of this conversation, I think the five of us sitting here having the conversation, we are all products of our environment. We are all white people. We've already acknowledged that we have privilege. We all acknowledge that we have grown up with unearned opportunities. But we also are part of the dominant cultural society. We aren't the different people as we see it. And part of what has happened is we've been kind of imbued with both genetically in a tribal kind of dynamic in kind of the back end of our brainstem. We have this tribal need to aggregate and affiliate. But we've also been imbued with expectations of cultural identity and race identity and bias. And it's very interesting when you actually look and open yourself and say, I want to learn about my own biases. And there's a wonderful implicit association test that's done at the researchers at Harvard have done that really helps you understand that no matter how well-intended you are, all of us have bias. I have bias. And it's bias on race, and it's bias on gender, and it's bias on religion, and it's bias on this and bias on that. It's embedded in us. We need to own our bias. We need to share the fact that we have bias. And we do, I think, have to do, as Lori suggests, when our bias comes out in really inappropriate ways and not intentionally, because it's not about intent for the most part. We need to own that and apologize for that.
Yeah, and that's kind of liberating. So the psychology on one side would be to get all defensive about, oh, I can't admit this part about myself exists, or I got to protect myself against your criticism of what I just said. It's this defensiveness. It's much more liberating to practice the grace of saying, yeah, boy, I screwed up. And own it, and not apologize for it, but I mean, not apologize for it in a defensive way, but to own it, and here's a data point that I can learn from and move ahead.
Is there time for another anecdote?
Quick.
Okay, so this anecdote, and I'd invite the others to chip in what would be a more graceful way of responding. I was in a workshop training session where there were lots of discussion around addressing age issues, gender issue, disability, all these things. And it was one of those exercises where step forward if you were educated, if you're white, if you're Christian, step backward if you've been in the foster care system, if you have a family member who's had mental illness, whatever. And the result of this going and coming, there was one African-American young woman at the back of the rows at the end of all this. And so there, in the debriefing of that and talking about what we take for granted and what we own and how we act, there was asking her the appreciation of how did that feel, being in that situation. So there was a good, healthy discussion that was well managed, but then it goes to the point of being well-meaning, and I'll ask you, what could you have said to get her sense across, but to say it differently? And a Caucasian woman said to the African-American woman, oh, I just want you to know that I think you're beautiful.
And I want to touch your hair, too.
The facilitator and I, our eyes met, and I wanted to say, oh, shit. Can't say that on television. And she was very gracious, of course, but well-meaning. Yeah. What she was wanting to do is embrace her verbally and to show that she was sympathetic. But what would have been another way in which she could have accomplished that without, and there'll be some white people that say, well, what was wrong with her saying that? Yeah. That's not hurtful, but what was wrong with that? And I invite anyone to give a comment about how that could have been done differently.
Say briefly what was wrong with that, and then we're tight on time,
okay,
so I want to keep these
she was wanting to show that she was empathetic.
Right.
Instead could have been, did that make you feel? This really makes me feel terrible that you were put in that situation. Own your own feelings and acknowledge that other person's discomfort or pain or whatever it is she spoke to. But to shift gears to this maternalistic, protective, misses the point.
Which differentiates her from the other person.
It misses the point. And I'm sure she had no clue that that was like an inappropriate thing. And the African-American woman just kind of like rolled her eyes. And said,
Again?
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And what about a response that said, I hope that each of us in this room can think about ways that we can work together so that there doesn't have to be anybody in the back of the line.
Right.
Boy, that's a good response.
Or the back of the room.
I like that.
That doesn't call her out even more.
Well, that was the purpose of the lesson, is to realize how we make assumptions. White privilege, we make assumptions about people.
Right.
At any rate, so.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Thank you.
So we're tight on time, but I want to cover some of the things that you folks had told me on the phone. You mentioned race competency mentoring. Can you say something about that in less than 1 minute?
It's a concept. It's a fledgling little baby concept. And what I meant about it when we talked on the phone was the concept of learning from each other. Maybe not so much mentoring. That maybe wasn't a great term.
It might be a formal, top-down apprentice master.
Didn't really mean that at all.
But the learning from each other.
Learning from each other and taking risks and taking it on ourselves to educate ourselves about white privilege, racial impact, disparate impact, disproportionality, all the ways that those things are connected, and taking responsibility for our own growth in that way, in the same way any of us would in any other educational endeavor. Or
And I would add one more piece to that, which is what I characterize as authentic allyship.
yes.
You know, there's intentional allyship, which we are prone to do because we are in control or we want to be in control. But authentic allyship actually honors the person who is the target of these dynamics.
And supports.
Yeah.
Right.
Supports in a way that the person wants
Yes.
the support.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
rather than a
And can hear the
paternalistic
support.
Right.
thing.
Yes.
Right,
Can
right.
feel the support.
Yeah.
Right.
And again, people watching the show might wonder, how come all these folks on the stage are white? White folks need to take responsibility
Yes.
for the race bias in our society and in ourselves. It would be unfair to make some person of color have to lecture us about what we need.
Right.
We want to hear from them. I mean, that's another model.
Yeah.
That's another thing to do. But I wanted to have white folks talking to our viewing audience, which is overwhelmingly white folks in this community, because we need to take responsibility for our, it's not fair to dump this onto people of color who have other disproportionate.
Well, we've built the
Loads.
systems and structures, and we are
we gotta-
in
Yeah.
dominant
Yeah.
cultural control.
And as people have mentioned, we very often have levers of
Yeah,
power
yeah.
accessible to us that other folks don't have. So
And I did want to
it's
mention
owning it.
when Glenn asked me, I pointed out to him, yes, I am white, but I'm Latina, which is ethnicity issues. So in terms of some of these systems and subtleties and overt actions and whatever, I mean, I can certainly relate to a great deal of this in another
Yeah.
subtext.
Yeah, thanks for that. So there are things to read. There are videos like the Jay Smooth video on YouTube. I've appreciated reading things by Tim Wise and Peggy McIntosh. And there's others. There are some great things about that. There are workshops and things that people can go to, be alert, and make sure that you go to the stuff and read the stuff that's actually constructive and helpful and authentic and real. We want to be able to affect the larger society and our own stuff. We've tried to cover both ends of it in this TV conversation. I want to mention a couple of the groups. We're tight on time, but I want to certainly lift up unity in the community that all of us are part of, and there's more than just the five of us in the group, and then concentric circles beyond that. And so it's www.olympiaunityinthecommunity.org, and that's great. And they deal not only with race, but minority
orientation.
relationships of sexual orientation or gender
And it's
identity.
really an
and
organization that
others.
is focused on addressing acts and conduct grounded in hate.
Right. Yeah. So that was kind of the origin and the main focal point. And currently now in the middle of 2015, we're trying to do some other things to help the community deal with issues better. But yeah, especially responding to hate crimes and things, and make sure that we can
And hate-based behaviors.
and see if we can stop that kind of stuff. But that's a great outfit. www.olympiaunityinthecommunity.org. So I want to lift that up. There's a new entity called Showing Up for Racial Justice, SURG, Surge.
Jay.
J. I can't even read my own typing here. SURJs, Showing Up for Racial Justice, thank you. And they have a website called showingupforracialjustice.org. And that's largely reaching out to white folks to get white folks to do organizing, kind of in the spirit of what we're doing here.
And faith-based communities.
And faith-based, yeah, they're broad in that range. So it's kind of like what we're doing here, where they're looking at the individual stuff and the systemic, and white folks need to take responsibility. They have various kinds of people in the group, but the main thing is to move white society individually and systems. The Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation is part of a 100-year-old national and international group that's for 100 years now has opposed all the wars, and we've done good stuff. But we also have for about 75 years have done some fairly significant racial justice organizing at the national level, and some during some eras that's a heavier priority, and some eras, peace, foreign policy things have overshadowed it. We're getting back to doing more and more racial justice organizing at the national level of the FOR, and the website there is www.forusa.org. You had mentioned the Harvard implicit association test. I'm sure there must be other resources around. Again, I want to lift up Tim Wise and Peggy McIntosh, who've done good stuff. Your 12-minute TEDx talk by Jay Smooth.
It's not my video, it's Ted.
No, I know, but you told me about it, and it's great. How would you like viewers to be able to help? I mean, there are a lot of ways to connect, a lot of ways to beef up our ability to do things. What would you like people to actually do?
I think the first thing that I think all of us have to do is to become self-aware, own our own sense of self, understand and not get defensive about the privileges that we have, the opportunities that we have, and the disparate outcomes that are realized by members of the Caucasian, white dominant cultural community. And at the same time, learn and understand how systems operate to oppress. The fact that every socioeconomic and law and justice indicator operates negatively for African Americans, Native Americans, Latino, Hispanic Americans doesn't mean that they are slovenly, they are incapable of gaining wealth, incapable of securing employment, incapable. We need to help understand the systems are legacy systems. They continue to grind and they continue to drive disparate outcomes.
Right. And they were created by people, and people can change them.
Exactly.
We can apply our good hearts and our good heads.
Yes, my answer to that would be is to listen. 80% of the time when involved in some incident around racial injustice or whatever is just listen and not assume that just because we're passionate about it, just because we're very anti-racist, that we're going to lead, we're going to take over. Get out of their space.
Okay.
The issues are theirs. What can we do to support and align, but keep in your own space.
Yeah.
Let them do their thing. We're not going to take over.
Yeah, that's a good way to wrap things up. I want to be able to thank our four guests. We have Lori Rasmussen, Alec Clayton, Kathy Barrows-Friet, Jim Bamberger. I want to thank the folks who've been watching. The program that we've been presenting here for an hour looks partly at systems, partly at ourselves, partly at other people around. There's all these interactions, and we can plug in if we're attentive, if we're aware, practice some compassion, use our best values, and we really can turn things around. That's one of the premises of this TV series, is ordinary folks can change big stuff, including race issues, foreign policy, everything else. So we've talked about solutions as well as problems. I invite you to connect with the organizations that we list in our credits, and invite you, if you have further questions, to contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093, www.olympiafor.org, and we can connect you with other resources. Thanks again for the guests, and thanks for the viewers.
Opportunity.